Okay, so today we are continuing our discussion of vaccines, and we're getting to concerns that people have with them, some perhaps legitimate, some perhaps not so legitimate. The main focus is communities and people of color and the issues they may have with the vaccine, but we're also going to talk about general concerns later on, maybe in a separate video, we'll see. So, quick reminder, some things you should know from the previous lecture. What are B cells? What are T cells? What are their roles in immunity? What is herd immunity? Why is herd immunity so important? What is an attenuated virus? How do you attenuate a virus? And how does evolution impact viruses and vaccines, which is a topic that we will be discussing more later on, specifically when we start talking about the process of evolution. So this is a picture taken in Tuskegee, Alabama, of a doctor giving a black man here an injection of something, and this is a picture of part of what was going on during what was called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This study, we'll put it in quotes, or experiment, happened between the 30s into the 70s, and this was by the United States Public Health, or the PHS, and the CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control. I like to show these colorized pictures because I think it helps to demonstrate how recent these things actually took place. But in essence, what happened is they went and they took and found a whole bunch of black men that lived in Alabama who had syphilis, and they diagnosed them with this. They knew that they had it, and they didn't tell them they had it. What they did was they said, "Hey guys, would you like health care? Come on down to the Tuskegee University down here in Alabama, and we're going to go ahead and give you health care." But they didn't give them health care. They didn't give them anything. All they did was study them. They studied how the syphilis was moving through their systems, how it was evolving, and ultimately how they were dying from it. Now, this is incredibly problematic because they knew they had this. They promised them health care, and didn't treat them. Even though the discovery of penicillin, or the manufacture of penicillin, became common practice as a treatment in the 1950s, they didn't tell them. It didn't come out until the 70s. Here's a picture of the syphilis bacteria. So after funding for this study was lost, they continued without telling any of the men, without telling any of their families, that they wouldn't be treated. And I misspoke. Penicillin became common usage in 1947, actually. So, and they did eventually get an apology from Bill Clinton, but that didn't happen until 1997, which is, a few years before some of you were born. But 1997 is, it's 24 years ago, but it's not that long ago. So another reason why black people might be mistrustful of the medical community in this country is because of this woman here. Her name is Henrietta Lacks, and she had cancer, and she wound up going to Johns Hopkins and trying to get treatment. And in essence, what happened is they took some of her cells, they did a biopsy, and they discovered that because these cells were cancerous, that they were immortal. They would not die. Or, the cells they could die, but you could also culture them perpetually in a petri dish. And so this woman's cells, this woman's physical body, was used for generations without her or her family's knowledge, without her or her family's permission. And this book was written by Rebecca Skloot. I highly recommend it. It's very accessible. It's a really good read. But Rebecca Skloot has estimated that more than 60,000 scientific articles have been published as a result of the usage of these cells. And these numbers like that seem kind of random, like maybe you're just throwing them out, maybe these aren't as common, maybe she wasn't as important. But I, as a graduate student, utilized Henrietta's cells. We had a little petri dish. We gave some of the cells one particular drug. We didn't give that to the other cells. And so, these cells are incredibly common and incredibly important. And finally, her family is getting some form of reparations. Rebecca Skloot's book, actually, the proceeds are going to her family members. Finally, she died of cancer at the age of, I think, 31. But finally, she's able to, and her family is able to get something from the fact that their mother had to die of cancer. And it was just kind of, basically, her cells were stolen from her by the medical community. So there are other inequities. There is a 2020 study that I referenced right here that you should look up, which states that Black babies are 3 times more likely to survive if they're cared for by a Black doctor. Which, I don't know, that's really problematic. And so, it's easy for people who look like me to just say, oh, just trust the vaccine, it's going to be fine. But 3 times more likely to survive if taken care of by somebody that has the same color skin as them. Minority women were also forced to be sterilized in the U.S. prison system. This is from like the 2000s through like 2014. There's an NPR article that I found that you can look up and that I will send you the link to if you would like to look it up. Although if you just Google minority women, U.S. sterilization prison system, you will find this. Okay. So these are just a few reasons, kind of off the top of my head, why certain communities of color might not trust a vaccine that they're being offered. So now, I guess it's my job to convince you that perhaps the system is different now. Hopefully the system is different now. And one of the big things is representation. So you have actual people of color who were involved in the development of this vaccine, who were involved in the development of this drug, including Dr. James Hildreth, who is he is a member of the FDA committee that authorized the first 2 COVID vaccines. There's also the very impressive Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett. Here she is standing with Dr. Fauci and President Trump, and she was describing some of the research that she was doing to these men. And so, before, I guarantee you all of the people who were involved in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, there was not a single person of color in any of the committees that approved or carried out that little bit of research. Okay, so there are people of color who are involved in the development of these vaccines, which, by the way, is not a guarantee that it's a good thing, but it is a good indication. We also have representation of people of color in testing. Okay, so this is Dr. Freeman Hrabowski III, who's actually Kizzmekia's boss. And he was involved in the first round of testing. Another important thing to keep in mind is that 10% of study participants, at least for the Pfizer vaccine, were African American. 26% of the study participants were Latino, 5% were Asian. There were older people involved here. My point being is that when we were testing these, there was actual representation here. It wasn't just a whole bunch of white people. And it has been shown that the virus can impact different communities differently. So there was like pretty good representative sampling when these things were being tested. There were people of color involved when it was being developed. On to some other concerns that I have heard. I've heard things like, can it change your DNA? And it's important to remember that no, it can't change your DNA. So your DNA spends all of its time in the nucleus of your cells. If we were able to look at microscopes, you can actually see the little strands of DNA in the form of chromosomes. But then you make the RNA copy of it. DNA, so RNA that's introduced to your cells does not interact with your DNA. The RNA that's injected into you, the mRNA that's injected into you when you get this vaccine, doesn't go into the nucleus. So it cannot change your DNA. And this is not new technology. Okay? We know about RNA. We know about DNA. We know how these things work mechanistically. So not only will RNA not change your DNA, but RNA can't change your DNA. Okay? This is not the same thing as CRISPR. CRISPR could change your DNA, but that's not what we're doing right now. Okay. So the next concern is, will the vaccine hurt you, or can the vaccine actually hurt you? And one concern is allergic reactions, or as it says here, anaphylaxis after COVID-19 vaccination is rare and occurred in approximately 2 to 5 per million who were vaccinated in the United States, which is 0.0005% have an allergic reaction. That is an astronomically tiny number. These people, this doesn't say they died or not. This is just saying that 2 to 5 per million. Okay, so if you have an allergic reaction to this, buy a lottery ticket, or don't, because you're unlucky. I don't know, but allergic reactions are incredibly. By the way, VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and so these things are very, very well studied. And if you go get a vaccine and you have a problem, you can talk to them and get your data reported, and they'll be able to help you with some things. But again, it's not going to happen because it's 2 to 5 per million people. There are also people that are worried that it will just kill them, outright. There's something funky with this. There's some weird ingredient. And according to VAERS, over 167 million people have been given the vaccine. And of those people, 2,746 have died afterward. Okay, so of the people who got it, 2,800 or so passed away. But interestingly, as it says here, CDC and FDA physicians review each case report of death, and as soon as notified, and CDC requests medical records to further assess reports. A review of available clinical information, including death certificates, autopsy, and medical records, revealed no evidence that vaccine contributed to patient deaths. CDC and FDA will continue to investigate reports of adverse events, including deaths reported to VAERS. So again, 2,700 people died, 2,800 people died out of 167 million. And it's inconclusive. It doesn't appear that those deaths were caused by the vaccine. So again, if you go and you get an injection and then you go skydiving the next day and something goes horribly wrong, your death report still goes into these numbers. Okay, so your odds of dying of it are exceptionally low, almost zero. Your odds of having an allergic reaction to it are exceptionally low, almost zero. Whereas in your likely cohort, if you actually get COVID, your odds of dying is about 3%. Okay, so it's I would say it's pretty worth it. I would say it's very worth it. When you have the opportunity, please do get vaccinated. Let's talk about some numbers here. So there have been more than 550,000 deaths in the US, and this number is likely very low, just because people didn't report it when they got it and they wind up dying from it, or they never go to the hospital. So many people in the United States have died from COVID already. Immunocompromised people very often cannot get the vaccine, and so you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm going to be fine. I'll just go, and if I get the disease, I get the disease. It's not a big deal. But you can potentially pass it on to these other folks who cannot get immunized because their immune system will not allow for it. There's also this notion of long COVID, which there isn't too much data on as far as I'm aware, but with long COVID, you just wind up having symptoms for a very, very, very long time. Even after the acute infection is over, you're still having respiratory issues, you're still having trouble breathing and stuff like that. So yes, I would say, in my opinion, and apparently in the opinion of the data, it is pretty worth it to go ahead and get a COVID vaccine.